The war was finished, but Europe still smelled like it was burning. Across the continent, cities lay cracked open, bridges twisted, roads cratered, and the ruins of the Third Reich continued to smolder in a gray, exhausted silence. In a British prisoner of war camp, in an interrogation room that looked like it had been designed to drain color out of the world, Captain B.H. Liddell Hart sat across from a man who had once helped shape Germany's defense of Western Europe. General Günther Blumentritt had been Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's chief of staff, one of the planners behind the effort to stop the Allied invasion. He had seen the war from the inside, not as propaganda, but as maps, orders, logistics, timing, and failure. Liddell Hart asked him a question that sounded simple, but carried the weight of years. What did you think of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery? Blumentritt did not answer in a sentence. He did not even answer with a shrug. He stood up. Then, slowly, he began to walk across the small room in a way that felt almost theatrical. One step, then another, deliberate and careful. His eyes lowered toward the floor as if inspecting it for cracks, as if testing for traps, as if every movement required confirmation before commitment. He moved like a man crossing a minefield in his mind. When he reached the far end of the room, he stopped, turned back toward Liddell Hart, and held the pose as if to say, "This is the answer. This is Montgomery." Not a word, but a rhythm. Not an opinion, but a demonstration. The defeated German general, without raising his voice, had just mocked his conqueror in the most cutting way possible, by showing that Montgomery could be understood as a predictable pattern of motion. That single performance hinted at something official histories rarely admitted. The Wehrmacht had studied Montgomery for years across 2 continents. They knew how he worked, they knew what he valued, and most importantly, they knew what he feared. Rundstedt, the senior German commander in Western Europe, had faced Montgomery from Normandy to the Rhine. When interrogators asked Rundstedt to assess the British Field Marshal, his answer came out measured and almost polite. Montgomery was very systematic, he said. That is all right if you have sufficient forces and sufficient time. It sounded like praise. It wasn't. Systematic, in a German general's mouth, was not a medal. It was a diagnosis. It meant methodical, controlled, cautious, above all, predictable. And predictable is a dangerous word in war. German doctrine prized speed, surprise, initiative. To call an enemy commander predictable was to say you could arrange your defense around him like furniture in a familiar room. You could guess where he would strike, and when, and how. You could prepare your artillery plans, your reserves, your counterattacks. It meant you could meet him on your terms. But then an uncomfortable question rises immediately. If Montgomery was so predictable, why couldn't the Germans stop him? If he moved like a steamroller you could see coming from miles away, why didn't they lay the charges and blow him apart? The answer wasn't only tactical, it was psychological, historical, almost cultural. Montgomery wasn't just fighting Germans, he was fighting the ghosts of the Somme, Passchendaele, Ypres, the mass graves of the First World War that lived in British memory like an inherited wound. He was fighting a national fear of repeating the same catastrophe. Huge armies thrown into chaos by reckless leadership. Men fed into killing grounds with no plan beyond hope. That fear shaped him, and it shaped the way his army moved. To the British public, Montgomery became reassurance in uniform. To German generals, he became something else entirely. A commander who would not be lured into traps because he refused to gamble unless the odds were crushingly in his favor. You can see that pattern harden into doctrine in North Africa. October 1942, the desert. For 18 months, Erwin Rommel had made the British look slow, confused, and constantly a step behind. His Africa Corps attacked where least expected, shifted axes of advance, exploited weakness, with a kind of aggressive confidence that turned tactical movement into legend. The British cycled through commanders trying to stop him, and each time Rommel found the seams, drove through them, and sent them back bleeding and embarrassed. Then Bernard Montgomery arrived, and instead of rushing into an immediate offensive, he did something that baffled his own officers and infuriated Winston Churchill. He refused to attack. For 7 weeks, he sat at El Alamein, building up strength. Churchill demanded action, raged, pressured, threatened. Montgomery ignored him. He waited until he had roughly 230,000 men against Rommel's 80,000. He waited until he had more than 1,000 tanks against Rommel's 500, only a portion of which were German machines that could truly match British armor. He waited until his air forces held a huge advantage, roughly 3-1. Then, and only then, did he attack. The battle lasted almost 2 weeks. It wasn't brilliant in the romantic sense. There was no lightning maneuver, no elegant stroke that won the day in a single afternoon. Montgomery ground Rommel down. He crushed him with weight, artillery, tanks, air power, supply. For British soldiers who had lived through repeated defeat, this predictability did not feel like a flaw. It felt like safety. It meant they weren't being hurled into another nightmare by men chasing glory. Montgomery traded time for lives. He was willing to wait if waiting meant fewer widows. And when Rommel finally retreated, Montgomery's pattern was established. Build up, attack with overwhelming force, accept slow progress if it prevented catastrophe. But the Germans noticed something else, something more revealing in what Montgomery did after he won. 2 months before El Alamein, Rommel had launched a final desperate offensive at Alam Halfa. Montgomery stopped him cold. The Afrika Korps was broken, exhausted, low on fuel, stretched across a supply line that ran for hundreds of miles. This was the moment a more aggressive commander might have pursued relentlessly, trying to destroy Rommel completely. Montgomery refused. He ordered consolidation instead. His subordinates stared at him as if he had missed the obvious. The enemy was retreating. This was when you deliver the killing blow. Montgomery chose control over drama. Rommel's intelligence officer, Friedrich von Mellenthin, studied the British halt with disbelief. To him, it looked like the British had been handed the chance to end the campaign and simply declined. Yet, in that decision, von Mellenthin recognized the deeper truth. The era of dashing cavalry charges, of bold pursuit across open ground, was dying. Montgomery had accepted that the British were not masters of mobile warfare in the German style. So he adopted a method built around what Britain could do best: systematic destruction through superior firepower, careful planning, and logistics. The Germans had a word for this kind of fighting: Materialsschlacht, the Battle of Materiel, a war of attrition where the side with greater resources simply crushes the other through weight. It was the one game Germany was almost guaranteed to lose in the long run. That is why German generals could call Montgomery predictable and still respect him. His method was not designed to dazzle. It was designed to grind. It was designed to win without gambling the army itself. He was a commander who minimized catastrophic risk. He would stall, he would pause, he would build up, but he would rarely collapse. That reliability mattered when Britain was bleeding manpower. By 1944, Britain was running out of men. Entire divisions were disbanded to fill replacement pools. Montgomery knew this reality with an almost physical clarity. One encirclement, one major disaster, one moment where a British corps vanished in a pocket, could break the British Army's ability to continue the war. He could not afford the kind of gamble that might create a legend but leave behind a crater. While Montgomery was shaping himself into the commander the British needed, another Allied general was becoming the commander the Germans feared. General George S. Patton entered the European fight like a different kind of storm. Blumentritt, who had faced both men, was asked after the war to name the most dangerous Allied general. He did not hesitate. Patton, he said, was the most dangerous. A man of initiative, of lightning action. The contrast was almost brutal. With Montgomery, the Germans expected a frontal assault. Massive, heavily prepared, deliberate. They could plan around it. With Patton, they had to keep reserves back because they could not predict his axis of advance. They never knew where the blow would land next, which meant they were forced to defend everywhere at once in their minds. And defending everywhere is the slow death of an army. That difference, respect versus fear, shaped decisions even before a single Allied soldier landed in France. Before D-Day, the Allies built a deception so elaborate it became one of the most successful lies in military history. Operation Fortitude. They created a phantom army group, FUSAG, and fed the Germans a story that Patton commanded it. Fake radio traffic, fake headquarters, inflatable tanks, staged logistics, an entire theater designed to convince German intelligence that the main invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais, the shortest route across the Channel. Normandy, in this fiction, would be only a diversion. The Germans swallowed it whole because it fit their own assumptions. Rundstedt and Rommel both believed that if the Allies were serious, if they wanted a decisive blow, it would be led by their most feared opponent. They could not conceive that Patton would be sidelined for a fake army. The consequences were enormous. One of Germany's strongest formations, the 15th Army, sat in the Calais region for weeks after D-Day, waiting for Patton. 19 divisions held back, immobile, because they believed the real punch had not come yet. Those divisions could have been thrown against the Normandy beachhead in the critical early days when the invasion was most fragile. Instead, they waited for a threat that existed only on paper. The Germans weren't just deceived by inflatable tanks. They were deceived by their own fear of Patton. By mid-1944, you can see the German view of Montgomery sharpen into something colder. July 18, 1944, Operation Goodwood. Montgomery promised a breakthrough east of Caen. 3 armored divisions, nearly 900 tanks, would smash through and race toward Falaise. It would be the largest armored attack in British history. On maps, it looked overwhelming, like a tidal wave of steel. But behind that mass stood a fragile reality: Britain's manpower shortage. Montgomery knew he could not afford a disaster, which meant his offensives were always engineered to limit risk. That engineering created its own weakness: rigidity. Major Hans von Luck commanded a German Kampfgruppe directly in the path of the attack. He had just returned from leave when the bombardment began. It was terrifying. More than 2,000 Allied bombers pounding German positions, the ground shaking, the air thick with dust and pressure. German troops huddled in their holes, waiting for the armor to roll over what must surely be a shattered defense. Then the British tanks appeared, hundreds of them moving across open fields. Von Luck watched and saw the flaw immediately. They moved like a parade, dense formations, buttoned up, rolling forward in straight lines, critically with little infantry support. The tank crews assumed nothing could have survived the bombing. They advanced with the confidence of men who believed the battlefield had already been cleaned for them. Von Luck's own defenses were disrupted. Anti-tank guns were scattered, but nearby, A Luftwaffe flak battery had 4 80mm guns that had survived. The battery commander refused to engage ground targets. His guns were for aircraft, he insisted. He did not take orders from the army. Von Luck confronted him with a pistol and a choice. Fire those guns at the tanks, or I will shoot you. The flak officer made the practical choice. The 88s opened up, and the field became a slaughterhouse. Tank after tank erupted. The dense British formations turned from impressive mass into perfect kill zones. Crews inside steel boxes suddenly realized they were not unstoppable. They were trapped, blind, burning. And then came the moment that German observers would remember as proof of what they believed about Montgomery's system. The British advance did not adapt with speed. It did not suddenly swing wide, bypass, improvise. When resistance hardened, the tanks halted and waited for orders. They did not flow around the obstacle like water. They stacked up like traffic. Von Luck's assessment was merciless. The leadership was methodical, but not flexible. They followed the plan even when the plan was clearly bleeding to death in front of them. Goodwood cost Britain hundreds of tanks. The breakthrough did not come. Caen remained contested far longer. And for German commanders watching, it reinforced the idea that Montgomery's army was powerful but programmable. You could anticipate its reactions. You could force it to pause. You could buy time. Then, in September 1944, Montgomery did something that seemed to contradict everything the Germans thought they knew about him. He proposed something bold. Operation Market Garden would drop 3 airborne divisions behind German lines in Holland. They would seize bridges while XXX Corps drove up a single road to link with them. If it worked, the Allies would gain a bridge across the Rhine and a corridor into Germany, an end run around the grinding lines of defense. It sounded like a gamble, and it was. That was what made it so seductive. For once, Montgomery looked like he was reaching for speed. But the Germans did not suddenly forget who he was. General Kurt Student, the pioneer of German airborne operations, happened to be near the drop zones. When the sky filled with parachutes and gliders, when the airborne armada appeared overhead, he was genuinely shocked by its scale. But within hours, Allied maps were captured. When Student and his staff understood the design, one narrow road, the entire operation hanging from a single elevated highway, they reportedly laughed. Not because it was harmless, but because it was so vulnerable. A plan built on one road is a plan that can be strangled. Field Marshal Walter Model, caught in the area, initially thought the drops might be a raid to kidnap him. Once he realized it was a major offensive, he applied standard doctrine: contain the airborne troops and cut the road. Force delays, create bottlenecks, turn the highway into a trap. He understood something crucial. Montgomery might have proposed a bold idea, but his system still hated improvisation. If the plan started collapsing, the British would not easily generate a chaotic, aggressive Plan B. They would try to restore the plan through method, and method takes time. Time was exactly what the Germans needed. XX Corps was Britain's most experienced armored formation. They had to drive roughly 60-plus miles in 2 days to reach the furthest bridge at Arnhem. The route was a single elevated highway through flat terrain, soon nicknamed Hell's Highway. There was little room to maneuver off the road. Any stoppage could freeze the entire column. And when the Germans hit them, the British did what they had been trained to do: stop, call in artillery, clear methodically, move forward again. When night came, they halted instead of driving through darkness. Timetables mattered. Procedures mattered. In war, those things can be strengths until they become chains. German officers watching the pace called it, with a kind of dark amusement, the standard Montgomery tempo. Not frantic, not reckless, controlled, predictable. They noted that if the column had driven like Americans, faster, more willing to push into uncertainty, it might have reached Arnhem in time, but it drove like British. That comment wasn't just a stereotype. It pointed to a real structural truth. Montgomery had trained initiative out of many commanders in exchange for centralized control. They were excellent at executing plans. They were less likely to exploit sudden openings without permission. They followed procedure, not opportunity. Up north at Arnhem, the British 1st Airborne Division was being destroyed while waiting for relief that never arrived. They held a shrinking perimeter at Oosterbeek for days, rationing ammunition, watching the sky, listening for engines that did not come. Every hour that XXX Corps lost south of them translated into graves on the north bank. For the men at Arnhem Bridge and then in the pocket, that agonizing slowness was not a minor flaw. It was a death sentence. The famous phrase, "a bridge too far," would later sound poetic. To the men dying in the perimeter, it sounded like an obituary written in advance. Market Garden failed. Montgomery's one great dash for speed ended in a confirmed German belief. Even when he attempted boldness, the spine of his army remained rigid. The Germans could disrupt it, slow it, and force it into time-consuming method. The war did not end by Christmas. It did not even get simpler. It got colder and bloodier. Then came December 16, 1944. The Ardennes, Germany's last great offensive, punched into the Allied line, creating the bulge that would become the largest battle the American army fought in the war. American units were overrun, roads filled with refugees and shattered columns. The front bent and threatened to break. General Hasso von Manteuffel commanded the 5th Panzer Army, the main striking force. German planners calculated that it would take Patton's Third Army at least 4 days, 96 hours, to disengage and pivot north into the German flank. That estimate was logical. It was based on what armies usually do. They take time. They need orders, movement schedules, supply adjustments, coordination. They pivot slowly because pivoting is complicated. Patton did it in 2 days. He tore the timetable in half. His units disengaged, pivoted north, and drove through winter storms to hit the southern flank of the German offensive. On December 26th, Patton's forces broke through to relieve the surrounded 101st Airborne at Bastogne. Manteuffel was stunned because the Germans had planned the battle around their assumptions, and Patton had made those assumptions worthless. He was not just moving fast. He was moving faster than enemy intelligence could comfortably track. It was the kind of speed that forces your opponent into panic, because panic begins when your predictions stop working. During the same battle, Montgomery took command of American forces in the northern sector of the Bulge. His first instinct was not to counterattack wildly, but to tidy the lines, to strengthen the defense, to pull units back from exposed positions and create a more stable front. Tactically, it was sound. It reduced risk. It made the northern sector harder to break. The Germans understood this immediately and felt a kind of relief. Not relief because Montgomery was easy to defeat, but relief because he was easy to read. When Montgomery took over, they could predict the tempo. They knew no sudden, reckless flank blow would come from that direction until he was ready. That certainty allowed them to shift attention and resources south to deal with Patton, the dangerous problem, the unpredictable one. This is why German generals described Montgomery the way they did. They called him a steamroller, slow, heavy, hard to stop once moving, but visible from miles away. Patton, in their language, was something closer to weather, violent, sudden, appearing where you did not expect, refusing to conform to planning tables. Montgomery rarely suffered catastrophe. Even when offensives stalled, Cannes, Arnhem, he did not let the army be annihilated. He avoided the kind of collapse that creates national trauma. The Germans respected him for that. They had to. You do not dismiss a commander who consistently denies you easy victories. But respect is not fear, and fear is the emotion that changes how an enemy behaves. The Wehrmacht feared Patton because he denied them the one thing soldiers cling to for sanity: the ability to plan. That was the meaning of Blumentritt's walk in that interrogation room. It was not only an insult, it was a confession that German professionals could match Montgomery's pace. They could prepare for each step. They could build defenses knowing that the British would arrive with time-consuming method. Every week Montgomery spent building up for a set-piece battle was a week the Germans used to fortify the next line. Every pause was a gift of time. Every cautious advance, even when it saved British lives, also extended the war's calendar. And the calendar is a weapon when you are bleeding men daily. And yet, there is another truth that makes the story uncomfortable. Montgomery's caution may have prolonged the war, but it also ensured there was a British army left to see the end of it. Britain in 1944 was not the Britain of 1940, and not the Britain of 1916. It was a nation stretched, manpower draining, political stakes enormous. Montgomery was the general you wanted if you feared incompetent leadership more than you feared the enemy. He would not spend your life on a gamble simply to satisfy impatience or headlines. He would make you suffer through slow attrition if that was the price of avoiding annihilation. Patton was the general you wanted if you needed the war to end quickly, regardless of cost, if speed itself was worth the risk. So was predictability a flaw or a strategy? German generals, speaking without propaganda and without the need to protect British reputations, offered the clearest answer. They respected Montgomery. They feared Patton. And that difference, respect versus fear, is not just a comment on personality. It is the difference between an enemy who can be planned for and an enemy who forces you to live in uncertainty. It is the difference between a war that moves at a timetable and a war that breaks timetables. It is the difference between a commander who wins battles safely and a commander who threatens to end wars by denying the enemy time to breathe. One of the strangest parts of this story is that Montgomery's greatest strength, his refusal to gamble, was also the quality that made him, to German eyes, less terrifying. He was the commander who would not suddenly appear behind you in the night. He was the commander who would not suddenly pivot an entire army with impossible speed. You could see him coming, step by step, just as Blumentritt acted out in that gray room. But the Germans also knew that if you misjudged him, if you treated him as harmless simply because he was cautious, you would be crushed under the weight he carefully assembled. That is why they called him systematic, with that thin smile that was not praise. In the German mind, systematic meant he would not beat you with genius. He would beat you with preparation. And in the end, preparation is what the Allies could afford, and Germany could not. The battle of material, the war of attrition, was always going to favor the side with deeper factories, bigger fleets, longer supply lines, more fuel, more trucks, more aircraft. Montgomery understood that. He turned it into a method. Patton understood something else, that time itself kills, that every extra week of war is a week of casualties, and that speed can be its own form of mercy if it ends the violence sooner. Both men, in their own ways, were shaped by the wars their nations had already endured. Montgomery carried the First World War like a warning sign. Patton carried the ancient cavalry spirit like a weapon modernized. That is why, when Liddell Hart asked what the Germans thought of Montgomery, Blumentritt didn't bother with adjectives. He walked. He showed the pace. He showed the caution. He showed the controlled steps that made British mothers feel safer and German planners feel confident they could predict the next move. Then he turned, and the silence in that room did what words could not. It forced the listener to see Montgomery the way the enemy saw him, not as a statue, not as a hero, not as a villain, but as a pattern that could win, a pattern that could stall, a pattern that could save an army, a pattern that could cost time, and a pattern that, in the final year of the war, shaped life and death across Europe one deliberate step at a time.